This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. Before becoming a central figure in one of the most widely discussed criminal cases in recent years, Ghislaine Maxwell was known primarily for her social connections and public profile. Born in 1961, she was the daughter of British media owner Robert Maxwell, a prominent and controversial figure in international business and publishing. Her early life was shaped by access to elite educational and social environments, which later influenced her position within high-profile social circles. After her father's death in 1991, Maxwell relocated to the United States. In New York, she became part of a network that included business figures, academics, and public personalities. During this period, she developed a close association with Jeffrey Epstein, a connection that would later become central to both investigations and legal proceedings. At the time, however, their relationship was not widely scrutinized. Publicly, Maxwell was often described as a socialite. She attended events, maintained connections within influential circles, and participated in various initiatives, including environmental projects and nonprofit efforts. These activities contributed to a public image that, for many years, remained largely separate from the allegations that would later emerge. Understanding this context is important. Because when investigators began examining Epstein's network, Maxwell's role was not initially defined by speculation, but by documented connections, travel records, social appearances, and communication links that placed her within the same environments. Early records show that Maxwell was frequently present in locations associated with Epstein. These included residences in New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Flight logs and other documents also indicate that she traveled within the same network, appearing alongside Epstein in multiple recorded instances. At this stage, however, presence alone did not establish a specific role. Investigators must move beyond association to determine function: what an individual did, how they participated, and whether their actions can be supported by evidence. This distinction would become central to understanding Maxwell's involvement. Because as more documents surfaced, through court filings, depositions, and investigative reporting, her position within the network began to be examined not just as a participant, but as someone whose actions were described in detail by multiple sources. Those descriptions would form the basis of legal scrutiny. And they would shift the focus from who she knew, to what she was documented as doing. As investigators and journalists began examining Jeffrey Epstein's network in greater detail, Ghislaine Maxwell's role started to emerge through documented records. These records did not rely on assumption. They were drawn from tangible sources such as flight logs, legal filings, and witness testimony. One of the earliest and most frequently referenced sources was aviation records. Flight logs associated with Epstein's aircraft listed passengers, dates, and travel routes. Within these logs, Maxwell's name appeared multiple times, indicating that she traveled within the same network across locations including New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. These records established consistent presence. However, like all travel documents, they only confirmed movement, not purpose. Being listed on a flight log indicates that a person traveled, but it does not explain the nature of their activities at the destination. This limitation required investigators to look beyond travel data. Another important category of records came from civil litigation. Depositions and sworn statements collected during lawsuits provided additional context. In these documents, Maxwell was referenced by multiple individuals, often in connection with specific events or interactions. Unlike flight logs, these sources introduced descriptive detail. Witness testimony can describe conversations, environments, and roles played by individuals within a particular setting. When multiple accounts reference the same person in similar ways, they can begin to outline a more defined picture. Still, these accounts must be evaluated carefully. Testimony can vary in detail and perspective, and investigators must compare different statements to identify where they align or differ. Consistency across sources increases reliability, but differences must also be considered. A third category of records involved communication and contact data. Address books, contact lists, and correspondence placed Maxwell within Epstein's network of associates. These materials showed that her connection was not incidental, but ongoing and structured. Taken together, these sources created a layered view. Flight logs showed movement. Legal documents provided narrative context. Communication records demonstrated connection. Individually, each source had limitations. But when combined, they began to reinforce one another, moving Maxwell's presence from isolated appearances to a pattern supported by multiple forms of documentation. At this stage, investigators had established more than proximity. They had identified repeated involvement within the same environments, across different locations and over time. This consistency raised a key question. Was Maxwell simply present, or did the records indicate a more active role? Answering that question required a closer look at how she was described within testimony and legal filings. Because as more documents were reviewed, the focus began to shift from where she was to what she was reported to be doing. As investigators moved beyond travel records and basic associations, a clearer picture of Ghislaine Maxwell's role began to emerge through witness testimony. These accounts, collected during civil litigation and later referenced in criminal proceedings, provided descriptions of actions rather than simple presence. Testimony differs from other forms of evidence. While flight logs and contact lists establish connection, witness statements attempt to describe what occurred within those connections. They offer narrative detail, how individuals interacted, where events took place, and what roles were observed. In multiple depositions, Maxwell was described as being actively present in social and private settings associated with Jeffrey Epstein. These descriptions often placed her in environments where interactions were not random but structured. Witnesses referred to repeated encounters across different locations, including residences in New York, Florida, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Repetition is significant. When similar descriptions appear across independent testimonies, investigators begin to assess patterns of behavior. Consistency does not automatically confirm accuracy, but it increases the weight given to those accounts when evaluated alongside other evidence. Some testimonies went further, describing specific forms of interaction. Witnesses alleged that Maxwell played a role in introducing individuals, facilitating communication, or being present during key moments within the broader network. These descriptions moved beyond general association and began to outline a functional role. However, testimony must always be evaluated carefully. Statements can vary in detail, perspective, and timing. Memory can be incomplete, and accounts may differ between witnesses. For this reason, investigators compared testimonies with other forms of evidence, such as travel records or documented timelines, to determine where they align. When alignment occurs, the evidentiary value increases. For example, if a witness describes being in a specific location at a certain time, and travel records confirm the presence of relevant individuals during that same period, the combined evidence becomes more compelling. Another important factor is legal context. Depositions are given under oath, which means false statements carry legal consequences. This does not eliminate the possibility of error, but it does establish a framework in which testimony is formally recorded and subject to scrutiny. Through this process, Maxwell's role began to shift in investigative terms. She was no longer only identified through association or proximity. Instead, multiple sources described her as participating in and facilitating aspects of the environment being examined. This transition, from presence to described action, marked a critical point. Because once actions are identified and supported by multiple forms of evidence, they can be evaluated against legal standards to determine whether they meet the criteria for criminal charges. And that is exactly what followed. As witness testimony and supporting records were analyzed, investigators began the process of translating those findings into formal legal allegations. This stage marks the transition from investigative inquiry to prosecutorial action, where evidence is evaluated against specific criminal statutes. The key question at this point is not only what was described, but what can be charged. Prosecutors must determine whether the available evidence meets the legal criteria required to bring charges. This involves assessing consistency across testimonies, verifying timelines, and ensuring that allegations are supported by corroborating material. In Maxwell's case, multiple sources contributed to this process. Witness statements provided detailed descriptions of interactions and environments. Travel records and communication data helped establish context, placing individuals in specific locations at particular times. When these elements aligned, they formed the basis for structured allegations. These allegations were not based on a single account. Instead, they were constructed through the combination of independent testimonies and supporting documentation. This approach is critical in complex cases, where no single piece of evidence is sufficient on its own. Another important factor is legal definition. Prosecutors must match documented actions to clearly defined offenses under the law. This requires precise language and careful framing. General descriptions or ambiguous behavior are not enough. Each allegation must correspond to a specific legal standard. This is where investigative findings become formal charges. Actions described in testimony are categorized, supported by evidence, and presented in a way that can be evaluated in court. This process transforms narrative accounts into legally actionable claims. Timing also plays a role. Allegations must fall within applicable legal timeframes, and prosecutors must consider statutes of limitations and jurisdictional factors. In cases involving events across multiple locations and years, this adds another layer of complexity. Once charges are prepared, they are formally filed. At this stage, the case enters the judicial system, and the focus shifts from investigation to legal adjudication. Evidence that was previously analyzed internally must now withstand external scrutiny in court. For Maxwell, this transition marked a significant shift. Her role, previously described through records and testimony, was now defined within the framework of criminal allegations supported by documented evidence. However, filing charges is only the beginning of the legal process. The next stage involves testing those allegations, through argument, evidence presentation, and examination within a courtroom setting. This is where the distinction between allegation and proof becomes critical. Because once a case reaches trial, every claim must be supported, challenged, and evaluated under strict legal standards. With formal charges filed, the case against Ghislaine Maxwell moved into a new phase, the courtroom. This stage is where investigative findings are no longer internal. They are presented, examined, and challenged under the rules of a criminal trial. In court, evidence must meet strict standards. Every document, testimony, and record introduced must be shown to be relevant, reliable, and legally admissible. This means that not all material collected during an investigation can be used. Prosecutors must carefully select the strongest and most clearly supported evidence. At trial, the prosecution's goal is to present a coherent narrative. This involves organizing evidence into a structured sequence that explains what allegedly occurred, who was involved, and how the actions meet the legal definitions of the charges. Witness testimony plays a central role in this process. Witnesses are called to testify under oath. They provide accounts of their experiences, which are then examined through direct questioning by prosecutors. These accounts are intended to establish facts and provide context for the evidence being presented. However, testimony in court is not accepted without scrutiny. The defense has the opportunity to conduct cross-examination, challenging the accuracy, consistency, and credibility of each witness. This process is designed to test the reliability of the testimony and identify any inconsistencies or gaps. This dynamic is essential. Unlike investigative interviews or depositions, courtroom testimony is subject to immediate challenge. Statements are not only presented, they are actively questioned in front of a judge and jury. In addition to witness testimony, prosecutors may present supporting records. These can include travel logs, communication data, and other documents that help establish timelines or corroborate statements. When documentary evidence aligns with testimony, it strengthens the overall case. The defense, in turn, may challenge how this evidence is interpreted. They may argue that records are incomplete, that timelines are uncertain, or that associations do not imply the actions being alleged. This highlights a key aspect of trial proceedings: the difference between interpretation and proof. The jury's role is to evaluate all presented material. They must consider the evidence as a whole and determine whether it meets the legal standard required for conviction. This standard is high, reflecting the seriousness of criminal charges. For Maxwell, this phase represented the first time her documented role, previously outlined through records and allegations, was fully tested in a courtroom setting. Every claim was examined, every piece of evidence was scrutinized, and every testimony was subject to challenge. This process would ultimately lead to a legal outcome: but that outcome depended on how the evidence was evaluated under these strict conditions. After weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal argument, the case against Ghislaine Maxwell reached its most critical stage, the verdict. In December 2021, a federal jury delivered its decision. Maxwell was found guilty on multiple counts related to her role in the activities examined during the trial. These charges were based on the evidence presented in court, including witness testimony and supporting documentation that prosecutors argued demonstrated her involvement. The verdict represents a key moment in any criminal case. It is the point at which evidence is no longer just presented or debated. It is evaluated and decided upon according to legal standards. For the jury, this meant determining whether the prosecution had met the burden of proof required for conviction. That burden is high. In criminal trials, guilt must be established beyond a reasonable doubt. This standard requires that the evidence, taken as a whole, leads to a conclusion that leaves no reasonable uncertainty regarding the charges. The jury's decision indicates that this standard was met for the counts on which Maxwell was convicted. At the same time, it is important to understand what a verdict does, and does not, represent. A conviction confirms that the court found sufficient evidence to support specific charges. However, it does not necessarily address every claim or allegation that may have been discussed during the investigation or in public discourse. In other words, the verdict defines legal responsibility within the scope of the charges, not the entirety of the broader case. Following the verdict, the process moved to sentencing. Sentencing determines the legal consequences of a conviction, including the length and conditions of imprisonment. This stage considers factors such as the nature of the offenses, the evidence presented, and applicable legal guidelines. For Maxwell, sentencing marked the formal conclusion of the trial phase. Her role, as defined through evidence and tested in court, had now been legally established within the framework of the charges brought against her. Yet even with a verdict in place, the case continued to have wider implications. Because the outcome did not exist in isolation, it was connected to a broader investigation involving multiple individuals, locations, and years of documented activity. This raises an important question. How did Maxwell's conviction affect the understanding of the larger network and the evidence connected to it? The conviction of Ghislaine Maxwell did not conclude the wider context of the case. Instead, it marked a significant point that influenced how the broader investigation, and the evidence connected to it, was understood. One immediate effect was validation of certain evidence. During the trial, specific testimonies and supporting records were presented, challenged, and ultimately accepted by a jury as meeting the required legal standard. This process gave those elements a level of judicial confirmation, distinguishing them from earlier investigative findings that had not been tested in court. This distinction matters. Before trial, much of the available information existed as allegations, depositions, or investigative material. After the verdict, portions of that information had been formally evaluated within a legal framework, providing a clearer boundary between what had been legally established and what remained unproven. Another impact involved interpretation of the network. Maxwell's conviction focused on her individual actions, but those actions were described within a broader environment. As a result, the case contributed to understanding how that environment functioned, particularly in terms of organization, interaction, and structure. However, the verdict did not extend beyond the charges presented. It did not determine the roles or responsibilities of other individuals who may have been mentioned in records or testimony. Each potential case requires its own evidence, its own legal process, and its own evaluation. This highlights an important limitation. Even in high-profile cases, legal outcomes are case-specific. They apply to the charges brought against a particular defendant, not to every aspect of a wider investigation. The conviction also influenced public and institutional focus. Following the trial, attention continued on related civil cases, document releases, and ongoing inquiries. The outcome reinforced interest in how the broader network operated and whether additional evidence might lead to further legal action. At the same time, the case demonstrated the complexity of pursuing multi-layered investigations. Events spanning multiple locations, years, and individuals require extensive coordination and evidence gathering. Even with a successful prosecution, many aspects may remain outside the scope of a single trial. For investigators and legal analysts, the result provided both clarity and limitation. Clarity, in that certain actions had been proven in court. Limitation, in that the broader picture was still incomplete. This balance is central to understanding the case as a whole. Maxwell's conviction contributed a defined and legally tested segment of the narrative, but it did not resolve every question raised during the investigation. And those unresolved areas continue to shape how the case is examined today. While the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell established certain facts through evidence and testimony, it also left important areas unaddressed. This is not unusual in criminal proceedings, where the scope of a case is defined by specific charges rather than the entirety of an investigation. One of the primary limitations is case scope. A criminal trial focuses on clearly defined allegations within a particular timeframe and jurisdiction. This means that events, individuals, or locations outside those boundaries may not be included, even if they are referenced in broader investigative materials. As a result, not all available evidence is presented. Prosecutors select evidence that directly supports the charges being tried. Material that is relevant to the wider context, but not essential to proving those charges, may remain outside the courtroom. This creates a distinction between investigative knowledge and trial evidence. Investigators may be aware of additional information, patterns, or connections that are not introduced at trial because they do not meet legal criteria for inclusion or are not necessary to establish the case. Another factor is evidentiary admissibility. Even if certain documents or testimonies exist, they must meet strict legal standards to be used in court. Evidence that is incomplete, unverifiable, or potentially prejudicial may be excluded. This does not mean the information is false. It means it cannot be legally tested within that proceeding. There is also the issue of unresolved questions. Some aspects of the broader case, such as the full extent of interactions within the network or the complete timeline of certain events, were not fully examined during the trial. This is often due to the limits of available evidence or the specific focus of the charges. Additionally, references to other individuals in documents or testimony were not the subject of legal determination in this case. A mention in a record or statement does not equate to a legal finding. Each individual's role, if investigated, must be evaluated separately under its own evidentiary standards. This is a critical point. The trial established Maxwell's legal responsibility for specific charges, but it did not serve as a comprehensive examination of every element connected to the broader investigation. For observers, this can create confusion. Publicly available documents may suggest a wider narrative, while the trial itself addresses only a portion of that narrative. Understanding the difference between these two layers is essential. The result is a case that is both clarified and incomplete. Clarified, because certain actions were proven in court. Incomplete, because other aspects remain outside the scope of that legal process. These limitations do not diminish the significance of the verdict, but they do define its boundaries. And those boundaries shape how the case continues to be analyzed. Following the trial and verdict, the role of media coverage became central to how the case of Ghislaine Maxwell was understood beyond the courtroom. With large volumes of documents, testimony, and investigative material available, journalists and analysts played a key role in interpreting and presenting this information to the public. Media reporting serves an important function. It translates complex legal proceedings into accessible narratives, helping audiences understand what occurred during the trial, what evidence was presented, and what conclusions were reached. In Maxwell's case, coverage focused on key testimonies, documented actions, and the outcome of the verdict. However, this process involves selection and interpretation. Not all details from a trial or investigation can be included in a single report. Journalists must decide which elements to highlight, how to structure the narrative, and how to explain technical legal concepts in a clear way. This can lead to differences in emphasis. Some reports may focus on the legal process itself, charges, evidence, and verdict, while others highlight broader context, including connections, timelines, or previously released documents. As a result, the overall picture can vary depending on the source. Another important factor is context. Legal documents and testimony are often highly specific and technical. Without full context, certain details may be misunderstood or interpreted in ways that go beyond what was established in court. For example, references to individuals or events in documents may be presented as significant, even when they were not part of the charges or legal findings in the trial. This distinction is essential. Being mentioned in a document or testimony does not equate to a legal determination. However, in public discussion, these differences can sometimes become less clear. Media coverage also interacts with public perception. As information is shared, discussed, and analyzed across platforms, interpretations can evolve. Over time, this can blur the line between verified facts, legal conclusions, and broader speculation. At the same time, investigative journalism has contributed to uncovering and organizing information. Through analysis of court filings, document releases, and historical records, journalists have helped bring attention to details that might otherwise remain difficult to access. This creates a dual effect. Media coverage both informs and shapes understanding. It provides access to information, but it also influences how that information is interpreted. For Maxwell's case, this means that public understanding is formed through a combination of court-established facts and ongoing analysis. Recognizing the difference between these layers is critical. Because the trial defines what was legally proven, but the broader narrative continues to develop through reporting, document releases, and public discussion. This leads to the final step. After examining the records, testimony, trial proceedings, and public interpretation, a comprehensive view of Ghislaine Maxwell's documented role begins to emerge. This overview focuses on what has been established through evidence and legal findings, avoiding speculation or unverified claims. At the core, Maxwell's role was defined through multiple forms of documentation. Flight logs and travel records established repeated presence in environments connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Witness testimonies and deposition statements described interactions and participation in events. Legal filings and trial evidence translated these descriptions into formal allegations, which were subsequently tested and upheld in court. Through this process, her actions were legally confirmed within the scope of the charges brought against her. The verdict demonstrated that her role was not merely incidental, she was found to have participated in activities that supported criminal conduct. It is also important to recognize the limitations of the record. While the trial established certain responsibilities, it did not encompass every interaction, every connection, or every detail referenced in investigative materials. Some aspects of the broader network remain outside the scope of confirmed legal findings, and public interpretation continues to evolve through ongoing reporting and document analysis. Nevertheless, the combination of documentation, testimony, and legal determination creates a well-defined picture of Maxwell's involvement. She was consistently present in key environments. Multiple witnesses described her actions and participation. Court proceedings confirmed her responsibility for specific criminal conduct. Her documented role highlights both coordination and facilitation within the network. Taken together, these layers demonstrate a clear, evidence-based understanding of her role, one grounded in records, verified testimony, and the judicial process. Finally, the Maxwell case illustrates broader lessons about how complex networks are documented and legally evaluated. It shows the importance of cross-referencing records and testimony, translating investigative findings into formal legal claims, evaluating evidence under strict standards, and recognizing the distinction between proven legal responsibility and broader public discussion. In conclusion, Ghislaine Maxwell's documented role is defined not by speculation, but by a structured combination of records, witness accounts, and verified legal findings. This case exemplifies how evidence and legal process work together to establish responsibility in complex, multi-layered investigations. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.